Hello and welcome to another of the Talk Wildlife interviews. Today I am delighted to have David Lindo with me. Hi, David.
Hello, Alan. Thank you for having me.
David is not only a good friend, he's also a TV personality, an author of books, a travel guide, and the guru when it comes to urban birding. Am I wrong in saying that?
Well, I mean, it's very nice of you to say that. Yeah.
Don't be modest. Come on.
I am known as the urban bird. I've been sort of making my life's mission to try and get people involved in nature through the medium of birds in urban areas.
Yeah, and we've got quite a lot I want to talk to you about, but I think we need to just start. For those that haven't read any of your books, and if you haven't, I can highly recommend them, especially the cover on this book, which was one of my favorite covers on any book ever. I love that because I love jackdaws. But for anybody that hasn't read your books, let's just start off just in sort of a few sentences defining what we mean by urban birding. So what is urban in the urban birding?
Okay, well, urban birding, in my eyes, is watching birds and also other wildlife, but certainly birds, within the confines of an urban space. So it could be a city, it could be a village, even it could be a town. I really feel that there's no real rules, there's no restrictions. You know, people have to say to me, "Oh, what's urban? What's," you know?" And I've always said, if you can look over your shoulder and see a house, then it's urban. You know, I think it's just. I mean, to be honest with you, the whole idea of the urban birder really was about finding a way of selling the idea of birding and eventually, you know, selling the idea of being aware of your environment and conservation, but through a package, a catchy kind of headline that will attract new people. Because I'm all about attracting new people, not so much people that already are birders. So my idea initially with the urban birder was to go to the media and sell this idea of this whole lifestyle choice that you can slot next door to yoga and Pilates and what have you, meditation. And anyone can do it. You don't even need binoculars initially. You don't need to have any knowledge of anything initially. You just need to be able to eventually tune in to nature and wildlife around you. I wanted to make it an entry-level scenario whereby people can get their first taste of conservation right on their doorstep. So that was the thinking behind it. Urban birding itself has existed, you know, for a long time. One of the earlier practitioners, I always get his name wrong, W.D. Hudson, I think his name is. He was an Argentinian naturalist based in London back in the turn of the previous century, 20th century. And, you know, he wrote about birds of London, for example. And there's other people as well, like, for example, one of my big sort of heroes is, or was, and still is really in many ways, Eric Sims, who was a prolific writer, broadcaster for the BBC, sound recordist, and he wrote a multitude of books, and some of them were very sort of urban centric. I mean, his book Birds of Town and Suburb was initially my sort of fire, even though I didn't realize at the time. It was my first ever sort of urban birding manual. I didn't even realize at the time what it was, but it really inspired me to find local patches right next to where I was living and to actually start watching things like your back garden, or, you know, just being aware of birds anywhere you go. And I realized very quickly that birds are actually everywhere, you know. And I also realized that birders especially, which I was quite surprised by, would often say, "There's nothing here, it's just pigeons and sparrows." But in reality, you know, there's a lot of birds to be seen in any urban area. And when you think that in Britain there's been 620, for argument's sake, species recorded ever, I'd say about 95% of those species have turned up in an urban area at some point. Even things like gannet. I mean, I remember seeing puffin on the Thames by Hammersmith Bridge. So anything can turn up anywhere at any time, and that's one of the mantras of an urban birder.
Yeah, and that's right, because I mean, wildlife doesn't have boundaries, so just because it says in the book that common scoter are a bird that you actually get out sort of, and you have to go sea watching to see, that's been proven recently by sort of Not Big, which is Nocturnal Migrants recording, that they actually travel across the UK and can be heard in the Midlands. So, birds don't have boundaries. So moving on from that, clearly London is sort of your patch, for want of a better phrase. And I'm sure, again, a lot of people have heard you talk about London, and if they've read your books, they've heard you talk about London. But I just want to read this from your website, because this is actually a really useful resource as well on the Urban Birds website. Highly recommend them. There are a series of city guides that you've put together, and I'm just going to run through a few cities. So Buenos Aires, Darwin, Vienna, Brussels, Sao Paulo, Bradford, Tallinn, Addis Ababa, Berlin, Budapest, Nairobi. So what I'm trying to do is give a picture there as, London's clearly your area. That's where you sort of started it all. But you've birded in a lot of cities. So let's pick on a few of those cities and just talk about what it was like birding in them, because I noticed on there one of them was Moscow. So what was it like urban birding in Moscow?
Okay, before I answer, I must apologise. There's lots of I'm in Spain, and the Spanish are quite loud when they talk. Let me just shut this door. Keeps on flying open all the time. Moscow. Actually, I went to Moscow for the European Cup final, Manchester United versus Chelsea, and I think it was 90. I can't remember what year it was, but basically, the birding was incidental. And I remember, being in the centre of Moscow and leaving the hotel, going for a stroll down the road, and it was chock-a-block with traffic, diesel everywhere, very polluted, and it was quite grey as well, with the impending rain. But I went into a park, and I remember just walking around, and at first not seeing too much, feral pigeons and white wagtails, and then I turned the corner, and aside from seeing a lot of very stony-faced, track-suited people exercising or drunk, very invariably, I turned the corner and there was this wooded area, and all of a sudden it was like the whole thing exploded into something else. It became much more interesting, and I heard the sounds, for example, of thrush nightingale, and I remember finding loads of fieldfares, and it was incredible. Birding in Moscow, I didn't enjoy generally, because I didn't enjoy Moscow. One of the very few cities I've been to that I really didn't like, because it was it was a very racist place, basically. If I not to put too fine a point on it, so I didn't feel very safe or comfortable. But I've been to 350 different cities over the last 15 years, so I think Moscow wasn't the best. But then maybe I need to go back again and meet someone who can take me to various spots. So I went, I just picked a park next to me to go birding. So maybe there's a different place to Moscow.
So let's look at that number again, 350. Did you say 350?
Yeah, about 350 different cities, yeah.
Right. Okay. So of the
I think I have the world record, Alan. Actually, I should.
Yeah, I'm looking through it. The list is phenomenal, and this clearly doesn't even cover all of the places you've been, because there's not 350 on here that I can see.
No.
So if you were to say outside of London and outside of the UK, this is my favourite spot. This I really, really enjoyed. That was a special time birding there. Which city would you choose?
That's a tough question to answer, because I think every city has its merits, even Moscow. I mean, the ones that jump up into my memory straight away are places like Los Angeles, because you kind of think of Los Angeles as being concrete, silicon, and big fancy cars, which it is. But then when you strip that away, it's actually a coastal city. So you know, when you go there when the migration's on, you know, you can find lots of really interesting birds in urban parks, just, you know, moving through a migration. So I love that particular place for birding. Also like quite a lot of European cities. Lisbon is another great spot, especially the Tagus Estuary, which is amazing. One of the, I mean, it's such a shame, but it's under threat from development, but it's such a brilliant place, one of the best places in Europe for waders. Um, so I love there. I think the city I'm in now, Merida in Extremadura, is absolutely spot on in terms of, you know, birding. It's incredible, the sort of stuff. In fact, in Spain, I'd put on that list, you know, places like Madrid, Valencia. There's several places. Malaga is another great place. And in Europe, generally, in Eastern Europe especially, when you go to the Baltic states, you know, Riga, Tallinn, all those places, Estonia and Latvia, and even in Lithuania, Vilnius, great places for interesting species. You can go into the equivalent of Hyde Park and be listening to greenish warblers during the summer and black woodpeckers in Vilnius. Um, and then elsewhere, I mean, you know, there's so many different places. I mean, Darwin in Australia was another really interesting place. The only thing that was a bit hard to take was the fact that it's so blinking hot there. It's really humid. There's a million mosquitoes, but it's actually worth all the bites to get some really interesting species there. So to name one city will be very difficult, and I think unfair on the others, because every city has benefits and has its own sort of thing, you know. So yeah, but they're the ones that jump out at me straight away.
So which of the cities that you visited, which was the most unusual to bird in? So whether that be because it didn't have many green spaces, or when it had, you know, which was the most unusual to bird in?
I think one of the places that I found kind of weird, I suppose, was the most southerly, I think it's the most southerly city in the world, or town in the world, Ushuaia in Argentina. I was there just before getting a boat to go to Antarctica. And the town itself is like a frontier town. Everyone, you walk around, everyone's wearing backpacks, you know, and everyone's from all around the world.
Yeah.
And you go to the seafronts, and there's southern giant petrels flying around, and the Chilean, I think it's a Chilean, I can't remember if it's a Chilean or the brown skewers flying around. And on the coastline you have crested duck, and it was quite fascinating because I didn't really expect to see such a variety of different birds in that place, because it didn't look very promising in a way. But that was interesting. That was quite a surprise. And then there's other places. I mean, the thing is, it's hard to surprise me sometimes, because I go to places with a very open mind. I think to myself, because sometimes I go to cities and I ask for assistance. You know, can someone take me around? So a bird that shows up, and he basically says to me, or she says, I don't actually, even though I live in a city, I don't actually go birding here. You know, so because urban birding is, again, it's quite interesting, because urban birding, when you go to a city, there's no information. You Google, you know, I've Googled many cities, like Seville, for example. I've Googled Seville, absolutely nothing, nothing. It all talks about Doñana and all those places outside, but nothing urban. So you feel like you are an explorer, an urban explorer, which I absolutely love. So in that respect, Alan, I get surprised all the time, even though I'm not surprised, because I expect to be surprised, because I go with an open mind, and I also go to places without any kind of expectations either. I think any city could be good. I'm sorry to give you a vague answer, but there isn't really one.
No, that's
spot.
fine.
There isn't really one city or one spot. I mean, I see it as a challenge. You know, I go to places which are full of concrete. Frankfurt's another example in Germany, and you go there, and you know, I know that I'll see things. And I'm walking in the concrete area, I look up, and there's a peregrine. I look into a tree, and there's a spotted flycatcher. You know, that people would never expect. I think one of the biggest surprises, and even though I wasn't surprised, was when I went to Hull in Yorkshire. People say to me, "Why are you going to Hull? Go to Spurn." And I said, "Well, because I want to see what Hull's about. And I went to Hull and I thought Hull was great. You know, I went to a couple of the parks. I went to All Home Strays, I think it's called. That was really, you know, I thought it was a really good spot. And I often go to cities with my mind open, thinking, you know, if I lived here, I'd be coming to this spot. This would be my local patch. So I kind of go looking for a local patch wherever I go. That's my kind of attitude. I don't go thinking I'm not going to see anything. I think I'm going to find something really interesting.
Yeah.
And I've got 100% record out, and I say this live on record, 100% record of being somewhere with someone, and you know, I say to them sometimes, even before we start going birding, that at some point during our time together, you are going to say to me, "I've never seen that here before," and I got 100% record. I remember going to Tunis and I was with this guy, and he was a bit blasé. He went to this really amazing-looking wetland in the middle of the city with rubbish everywhere. And you know, I was sifting through the dark, and most of them were shovelers. And then I found marble teal, or marble duck. And I remember saying to him, "Oh, I've got a couple of marble ducks here." This blasé, you know, I didn't realise how rare they were. He said, "What? Let me look." And he looked, and it was obviously there. And he said, "Never seen that here before." So, you know, that's the great thing about urban birding as a birder. You know, it's, oh, they're gone now, my cleaners. It's a discovery, you know, it's just going somewhere and realizing that you are an explorer. You are then this place for the first time with a new set of eyes. You're going to try and discover new species for this particular city. And it's easy because no one else does, or very few people do. So that's the great thing.
Yeah, and because you've mentioned obviously the people that you've been there with, you've mentioned that you know, even some birders and a lot of birders don't see urban as somewhere to birdwatch. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that people automatically assume that, well, if it's built up, it's not going to be any good?
I think, you know, urban birding, especially back in the day before it was labelled as urban birding, was always seen as a poor cousin, a poor relative to proper birding. And I remember, you know, as when I was younger, you know, I used to hang out in Norfolk and Suffolk and Kent and all those places as anyone else did. But when autumn came, instead of rushing off to Dungeness or, you know, to some headland somewhere, I'd rush back into the city because I was excited to find migration within the city. And there's a microcosm of the migration that goes on in the cities. Because people think that all the birds just go to all the famous landmarks and nature reserves. But in reality, migration is across a broad front. And I think to myself, right, there's been a whole load of birds. It's spring now, and there's been a whole load of birds seen in Portland Bill coming in off the sea. You know, that means if I go to my patch tomorrow, I might see some of that. There was a massive number of spotted flycatchers that showed up at Portland, maybe about 11,000 birds that are held up, you know, crossing over the channel. I rushed to my local patch, and I found 11 spotted flycatchers, which to this day is the most I've ever seen at my patch, as well as other birds like red star and wheatear. And I also think to myself, for example, going back to Wormwood Scrubs, whenever anything turns up at the London Wetland Centre, which is literally 2 miles south as a crow flies, I'm not going to the London Wetland Centre. I'm going to my patch because I know that if there's a Richard's pipit or a ring ouzel at the London Wetland Centre, then there might be one in my patch. And that has happened on a couple of occasions. I've actually found stuff, you know, that echoes what's been seen elsewhere. So I think, you know, urban birding really encourages you to be vigilant. It really encourages you to be creative in terms of your choices of where you go. It encourages you to be a pioneer. It encourages you to discover new places and actually watch them. And you also become very aware of habitats, super sensitive in many respects. You kind of, you know, I when I visit any city, I'm looking at the landscapes. I'm looking at the areas where, oh, that looks interesting. That could really attract, you know, migrants in the autumn. That's how I map out sites and areas when I actually visit them, and invariably no one's actually doing that. So it kind of makes it interesting. I mean, a little known fact. You're going to get a few exclusives here, Alan. A little known fact is that in the early '90s, I was actually co-writing Where to Watch Birds in the London area with Dominic Mitchell, and I was doing the western half of London. And my idea, even back then, was not to just major on the places that everyone knew, like Staines reservoirs and all the normal places. But I wanted to also discover new places. And I looked at a map of London. I looked at all the green spots. I thought, right, I'm visiting this green spot tomorrow. I'm going to walk around and just make an assessment. And I show up, and of course, there'll be no references at all to these areas. But I'll see, oh, that's interesting. There's some brambles over there. So maybe there might be some, black caps and stuff in the autumn. Maybe this bit looks good for chiff-chaff breeding. And I made assumptions. And that's how I discovered Wormwood Scrubs, because I had this area of green right next to where I was working. And I thought, I'll pop over there. And I remember looking up the London Bird Report from 1940 to, well, then it was the 90s. So I looked through every one, and there was only one reference to Wormwood Scrubs, and that was in 1969 when the ringtail harrier was seen flying over. I thought, that's enough, an invitation for me. And I remember going to this spot, and people saying to me, "Why are you going there? You should be out in Minsmere or going to Clyde." And I'm thinking, no, because this is interesting. And it obviously became interesting because I started birding there in the autumn of 1991 or something like that. And within the first 6 or 7 visits, I found pied flycatcher, tree pipit, red stars. And I was thinking, this place is interesting. And then that's how it kind of went. So that's why I think as an urban birder, you really, especially living in the city, and for me, my background living in the city, I always felt that I had to try harder because you don't have the access to Titchwell or to Sandwich Bay, and you don't have the access to see lots of different things all at once, commonly. So you have to work at recognizing common birds, which I did for 15 years of my life, the first 15 years of me birding from the age of 5. I'd have spent looking at my garden and really intimately getting to know the blackbirds, the robins, the carrion crows. So that next step, when I started going out to new places, I automatically knew I was looking at something different because I was so used to the common birds. I think that's such a, on reflection, that's a really good way of learning about birds. You learn about the common stuff, really get into them because the common birds are great.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I say.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we all hear and we all know that birds are, as most wildlife is, struggling for various reasons: climate change and habitat change and hunting, and they're up against it. So, given your time birding, so specifically around London area, what changes have you seen in sort of what you would usually class as the common birds? What changes have you seen? Because we've now heard that the chaffinch is in serious trouble. We know about the greenfinch being in trouble. We know about the declining house sparrows. What's your experience of that?
It's interesting because as a kid, you don't know any different, and plus I had no mentor, so I had no reference at all. So I just saw what I saw, and I remember, I lived in Wembley in North London, and I had my garden, that was my local patch, and then it kind of moved on from there to the local park, which had an area, that had a river running through it, the River Brent, which was basically just a concrete basin at the time. And then over the other side of the river was this wilderness, which I thought was like my countryside, but in reality it was just waste ground. People used to dump stuff there. But I've seen flocks of tree sparrows every winter. I've seen skylarks were nesting there. I've seen a whole range of birds which I took for granted. But then over the years, you suddenly start realizing that all these places have been built upon. You realize that in urban areas, nothing is sacred. There's always a beady-eyed chainsaw wielding JCB driving developer ready to sort of concrete over the next available spot. So you realise that the fragility of these places, and in that happening, you also begin to notice sharp declines. So I used to see, for example, even in Wembley, I used to see yellow hammers quite regularly, lesser spotted woodpecker even. All those birds, they're all gone, and with them comes this kind of manicured, sort of horrible clean cut concrete with sort of mowed hedges, well, not even hedges actually, mowed sort of grass, but concreted over sometimes, you know. So you can see it all becoming very homogenized, and as a result, a lot of birds start going. But then that said, I mean, when you start exploring other places, like for example, when I started going to the scrubs, I also realised that there were pockets where species existed where people may not have realised, and that made me realise as well, in turn, that urban places and urban birding is such an important thing to do to chart the existence of other species that people may not have thought before. So, for example, me going to the scrubs, I realised that, you know, when I submitted my records, I realised that, you know, we had a very important population of breeding song thrush, and even linnet were breeding in fairly good numbers. We had the closest population to central London of meadow pipits nesting. All that stuff would never have been known had it not been for someone like me or another birder going somewhere else discovering these things. And once you discover these things, your job, as far as I'm concerned, is to then let the local population know about it, and then fight with them to get the place protected, and, you know, to instill some kind of pride in that local area to get those habitats protected. So at the scrubs, you know, when I realised that there were meadow pipits nesting, I thought, oh my lord, you know, this grassland, maybe 14 acres, nothing, is being traversed daily by dog walkers. We got to do something about this, you know. So I got onto the council, and eventually they put up signs which were routinely ripped out, and then we had to concrete the signs in, asking people not to walk through the area during certain periods of time when they're breeding. And, you know, people tapped me on the shoulder when I was trying to count the numbers of meadow pipits. And what are you doing? Oh, I'm watching meadow pipits, looking for meadow pipits. And I explained what they were. I showed them pictures. I said, oh, there's one there, you know. And people began to have this pride. And eventually you'd be tapped on the shoulder and someone will say, did you know we've got nesting meadow puppets here? So when the Chinese whispers get back to you, that's amazing, because you know them, but there's a job being done. So yeah, I have noticed a lot of declines. There's been other things that have obviously increased, including my lovely friends, the ringneck parakeets, but also other species seem to have done quite well as well. So there has been swings and roundabouts, and also there's been, especially in the last 20 years, there's been places that have been developed with nature in mind. I mean, the classic is the London Wetland Centre, but there's other areas where people are trying to actually create this habitat, or trying to keep an area of the park wild, to you know, having meadows, or having to attract butterflies and bees and other invertebrates, which in turn attracts birds. So it's more of an education. We need, you know, to talk to developers to get them to create estates that already have ponds and already have lots of woodland and reed beds, so that kids grow up seeing more green and blue and not just grey, and they grow up thinking, I don't need to chuck the scooter that I've just stolen into this pond, you know, because there's frogs and newts in there. And, you know, it's education, which is so important at this point.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And interesting that you should mention ringneck parakeets and call them your lovely friends, did you say? I have to confess, I do love a ringneck parakeet. And when we used to, because David and I were on the Wade Quest Board of Trustees together, and when we used to have the meetings at the London Wetland Centre, I used to get really excited about seeing them. They didn't ask to be here, but they are here, and they're a bird, so of course I'm going to like them. But I did used to get a bit of stick from various other parties about that. So what's your opinion on ringneck parakeets?
I think you like them because you are in Norfolk, right?
Yeah.
You're not overrun with parakeets, so you can just come and visit and then leave, yeah?
Yeah.
Whereas in places like London, but other cities as well, they are quite prevalent. And look, there's a plus side and a negative side. The plus side to the parakeets are that ordinary people, look up and hear this squawking. Once they get over the fact that it's a parrot and it might have escaped, they then get drawn into nature, because especially when they see groups of them flying into roost. It is a spectacle, and I think it's a really great gateway to inviting people into our world and into their world, which they should be there anyway. On a personal level, I mean, I've seen them increase from being the odd bird now and again. I mean, I probably saw budgerigars more than I saw ringneck parakeets at one point. And then on my local patch in Wormwood Scrubs, eventually overnight there's like 5,000 roosting, and they make a racket in the morning. Okay, most of them go, but they actually make a racket, especially during the dawn chorus, which I want to enjoy what's there, not hearing talking of parakeets. And there is, evidence that they are bullies at the bird table. They get other smaller birds stressed. And I mean, there's anecdotal evidence about them stealing other birds' nest holes. I mean, I'm not so sure about that because I don't think there's much concrete evidence of that. Because I remember, again, at the Scrubs, visiting a tree that had 2 starlings, a grey spotted woodpecker, and parakeets nesting in the same tree. So, but yeah, I'm not a major fan. I don't really like the idea of these feral birds in urban areas, to be honest. I go to some places and it's really terrible. You got, some places where there's miners flying around, and 2 or 3 different species of parakeet that shouldn't be there flying around, and even pigeons that shouldn't be there, aside from feral pigeons, and it kind of, for me, spoils it a little bit. I think the biggest example of that for me was when I went to Hawaii. I was working in advertising at the time, and I worked on the Guinness commercial with the surfers. And I had, for my sins, I had to stand on the beach for 2 weeks in Hawaii, watching the filming out to sea. It was awful. It was awful. I mean, I got burnt on my shoulder for the first time in my life. But in 2 weeks, I saw 13 species of birds, 13 actual natural species. The rest of them are all, it's like walking in an open air aviary. They're all introduced species.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to go up in the mountain to see some of the endemics, but 13 species in urban areas, that was terrible.
Yeah, I can imagine. And sort of moving on slightly from Hawaii, but not too far. Cleveland, Ohio. We talked just before we started the interview about the fact that you were up till daft o'clock in the morning doing a interview, a talk. Can you give us a background? Because I was really intrigued by the project, and it shows that. I mean, when I introduced you as all sorts of things, author, blogger, interviewer, all of that stuff. What I didn't say at the time was, I also see you as sort of a conservationist. And this I think is a really good example of David Lindo, the conservationist.